The Legend of Zelda is in an odd spot at the moment. It's not broken per se, but it is very different from what the series used to be. And because of this, we've got fans on the one side defending it to the death, and we've got fans on the other side attacking it to the death. Now, watching my recent videos, you might think I'm one of the latter, but you'd actually be surprised. My take on the current state of Zelda is quite simple. I defend the parts of the games that I like, and criticize the parts that I don't. There are definitely fans on either side of this argument that are much more passionate about their sides than I am. But no matter what side you're on, if you're watching this right now, you can breathe a sigh of relief. Big Bandit's here to fix all this. I believe there exists an idea for the next Zelda game that, if implemented, would appease both attackers and defenders of the current Legend of Zelda. 20 ideas, to be specific. Let us begin. Number 1, I think it would be a good idea to rework the current weapon system. I've never been one of those people that absolutely despises the weapon system that was introduced in Breath of the Wild. I think that this is a fine concept in and of itself. I think that a lot of other open world games use the same kind of durability concept for their weapons. I just think that it could be massively improved upon. I think Nintendo needs to rebalance it from the ground up. I think that more powerful weapons need to be a lot more rare to find, and consequently, I think that weapons need to have a lot more durability, just on average. I'm not saying that every bokoblin out there that's carrying a Bokobat should no longer drop their Bokobat. That would be unrealistic, and I actually like the fact that if you can see an enemy using a weapon, they drop said weapon. That's a great gameplay mechanic in my opinion. What I'm saying is that there should be a lot fewer more powerful weapons out there. Giving players fewer, more powerful weapons would make those weapons a lot more valuable. And subsequently, I think the same kind of thing could be implemented for Tears of the Kingdom's new weapon system, which is to say the forging system. I love it personally. It's just simple enough to keep things fresh. I just think, again, that they could do a lot more with it. Maybe multiple items can be fused into a weapon. Maybe there can be more effects than what we've currently seen. Maybe some items fused onto a weapon can repair that weapon. Some items fused onto a weapon can increase its durability. Or you can combine a durability increase with an electric mushroom, something like that, to zap your enemies but also keep your weapon for longer. The possible combinations would be endless. But speaking of new combinations and new weapons, what if the new Zelda game introduced new weapons entirely? So in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there are 3 kinds of melee weapons. One-handed, two-handed quick, and two-handed slow. And yes, Link will swing them at different speeds or maybe slightly differently depending on if you have a blunt weapon as opposed to a sharpened weapon, but that doesn't change the fact that there are only 3 very basic weapon types out there. I would love to see Link able to wield, of course, spears and swords, but what about bigger swords or smaller swords like daggers? What about dual wielding? What about hammers? Or a giant mace? What about a ball and chain or a smaller handheld one called a Morning Star? What about a whip? What about new kinds of bows like great bows? Or crossbows? And here's a thought that I'll kind of go into a little bit more later on, but what about introducing new legendary weapons for Link to wield? What if, for instance, you could stumble across Ganon's trident, and these other legendary weapons would grant special abilities? And I know I've been rambling about weapons for a while, and trust me, the other points on this list are not going to take nearly this much time, but weapons is such a broad subject, I really needed to just put all my thoughts out there. The last thing I'll say about it is, I think that weapons should be repairable. I think this is something that people have complained about since Breath of the Wild in 2017, and it's definitely something that should have been an addition to Tears of the Kingdom, which was not, sadly. I understand that Nintendo felt that being able to repair your weapons would hurt the mechanic that they were going for, which is continually just keep exploring, keep finding weapons, keep swapping to new ones, and whatnot. But if you implement a durability mechanic, that could accomplish the same thing. Sure, you might have a great weapon. Sure, you might really like using that weapon. Sure, it might have cost you an arm and a leg to get that weapon, but once its durability hits 0, you can't use it anymore. Gotta go get it repaired. And in the meantime, you have to find the other weapons that you've picked up. It could work, it should work, and it would definitely help fix the next Legend of Zelda for everybody. Next up, speaking of reworking things, I think that the entire eating mechanic in Zelda should be reworked. I do enjoy the addition of Link being able to eat things in order to regenerate health and achieve different status effects, but we've got to be honest with ourselves. The moment that they introduced health regeneration as a solely making Link eat things mechanic, they removed collecting hearts. And this might be my nostalgia talking, or it might just be the argument of a different style of game, but I kind of miss having to look for hearts. Furthermore, I think that giving Link the ability to just pause the game at any point and eat 1 million apples at any given point and regenerate unlimited amounts of health was kind of a change for the worse. It made things a bit too easy. The only real way that you'll get killed in this game is if you fall off of something or if something hits you hard enough. In the older Zelda games, if you were really struggling with a fight and you were out of potions or you just couldn't find any hearts around you, all the pots were gone, the grass was gone, the smaller enemies to kill for hearts were all gone, then you were kind of out of luck. But it's tricky because I, on the other hand, do enjoy all of the various cooking and effects that Link is able to get from eating things in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So what do we do in the next Zelda game to implement maybe both of these systems? Well, I'm glad you asked. For one example of how to handle this, I would like to reference Genshin Impact. Now, for those of you who have played the game, you probably know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, in Genshin Impact it has a very similar pause the game, eat something to regenerate your characters' health mechanic. However, your characters can't just eat a million things at any given point. They have an appetite, and if they're full and can't eat anymore, then they're full and they can't eat anymore. Therefore, it's a hard cap on how many things you can stuff down the gullet of your characters. It is a little odd that Link can eat 500 apples, 200 mushrooms, and 3 multi-course meals in any given instant. I mean, I'm sure he's got a fast metabolism, but that's a little freaky. And maybe we could flesh this out a little bit more. Maybe not all meals are created equal. Maybe a smaller, just chicken on a stick meal could take up this much of his appetite, but a full course, big, grand turkey could take up this much of his appetite. And the effects would differ as well. This only regenerates 1 heart, this regenerates 5. And in the meantime, you could also find hearts in grass, pots, or on minor enemies all over Hyrule. I could see it working very well, actually. And potions, on the other hand, could not take up any appetite because, you know, you can always drink, right? Number 3, and perhaps the most obvious of all of them, we need a new map. Traversing this current land of Hyrule has been fun, and it's so big and so vast that they even used it again in Tears of the Kingdom, just with some added Sky Islands and an added depths area. The Legend of Zelda has always had a day-night cycle, or at least ever since Ocarina of Time. But you know what none of the Zelda games have ever had, and I'll get a bit more into this a bit later on? They've never had seasons. And I think this is because there have always been the winter areas, the summer areas, in the same map of Hyrule. What if there are multiple maps that you can travel in between? Multiple states, if you will. And here's another thing about the new map that we're going to need going forward. Should Link's Spider-Man climbing ability return? If you think about it, it affects everything. It affects how intricately Nintendo designs every single angle of their maps. It affects puzzle design and many more factors of the game. Personally, I don't think that it's necessary. I have enjoyed climbing ever so slowly up the side of whatever in the world I wanted to if I had enough cooked Stamina shrooms in my bag, but at the same time, there is an irreplaceable mechanic that is lost when anything can be scaled. It's the very mechanic that they inject back into the games whenever Link does a shrine, for instance. Nintendo just said, nope, you can no longer climb in here because if you can climb over everything, that ruins like half of the puzzle ideas out there. So I see there as being several benefits to removing Spider-Man climbing for Link in the next Zelda game. Nintendo can take more time to focus on designing other elements of the game, or they can take more time to design more map in general, while not necessarily having to design it with quite as much verticality as they did every single inch in the current world of Hyrule. Another slight thing that I would like to see in the next map, wherever it may be, Hyrule or not, is the addition of wandering bosses. Think about it, we've got world bosses already, and they've been implemented very well. You can target exactly where a Gleeok is, exactly where a Hinox is, exactly where a Stone Talus is. If they do roam, it's within their little section. I understand that that might be more difficult in general, but it would be pretty cool. It would make the world feel really alive. For an example of a game that accomplishes this very well, think of Elden Ring. And yes, Elden Ring is a significantly more difficult game than Zelda ever has been, but the concept could still be implemented, I think, in a way that's not quite as inaccessible for casual gamers. Number 4, another very big one that's close to my heart. Bring back Pieces of Heart. I understand why they removed Pieces of Heart from the game, because they wanted to make a purchasable system for heart containers and stamina vessels, which worked. But let me paint you a picture. Imagine you walk into a village, let's call it Kakariko Village, and you walk into a house, and in the corner of this house, there's a cage, and inside the cage is a cow and a piece of heart. It's right there. You can't enter the cage though. How do you get it? You're left to wonder and puzzle and think outside the box. And this isn't even a dungeon puzzle. This is just in the world of Hyrule somewhere. That very scenario that I just painted is one of the most famous pieces of art to collect in Ocarina of Time in Kakariko Village. And it is a staple of the Zelda series. Something being dangled right in front of you, just out of reach, that you'll have to think very hard about how to get to. And I think that they could be added back to the next Zelda game, even if Nintendo wanted to bring back this multi-hundred shrine setup that they have loved since Breath of the Wild. Let's say there are 200 new shrines in the next game. What if at the end of each of them, they don't each give you the same thing, an orb of blessing or an orb of light or whatever they're called, but instead, some of them will give you a piece of heart, and some of them will give you a piece of stamina, and some would give you other rewards entirely. Very rare weapons, very rare potions, rare pieces of gear, and they could also add back in pieces of heart in the world of Hyrule at large. Put one in a tree, have a flying enemy around carrying one in their talons, and you gotta figure out how to get up to it and knock it down, and leave the solution up to the player. Adding pieces of heart back into the game could work so easily, and should work, and would still appease all kinds of fans out there. Number 5, one of the most requested things since Breath of the Wild came out, the return of dungeons. I know what you're thinking, but Bandit, didn't they bring dungeons back in Tears of the Kingdom? No. Well, they did, I guess, but you know, they were just the same as the Divine Beasts, and I guess you could call them dungeons. But when people ask for the return of Zelda dungeons, they're talking about much longer experiences that are much more notable, much more memorable, with a lot more puzzles involved. But I'm not just slamming my fists on the table like an old nostalgic fan saying, "Bring me back what I was used to, I don't like this new stuff." I'm here to tell you, what if they brought back dungeons in a new way? Here are a couple ideas branching off of that seasons changing idea that I had a little bit ago. What if some dungeons were ephemeral, which is to say, temporarily accessible? Imagine there's a dungeon on top of the frozen icy mountain, and you can only access it in the spring, summer, or fall, because in winter it is way too cold to go up there. The entire pathway is just iced over, and believe it or not, Link can no longer just climb up the side of frozen freaking ice anymore, and it's way too cold for any fire to melt it. Or what if the dungeon underneath Death Mountain is only accessible in the winter? Because in the spring, summer, or fall, things are just way too hot. Link's skin sets on fire just trying to enter the area. Or, get this, what if there's a temple that just so happens to be underwater that's only accessible in the spring or the fall? Maybe this lake that it's positioned in is in between Death Mountain and the Icy Mountain, and in the summer it's too hot to enter the water, and in the winter the water freezes over. And that's just one element of ephemeral dungeons. There could be dungeons that slip in and out of time. There could be dungeons that slip in and out of reality. There could be dungeons that will levitate into the sky for some jargon lore reason. I'm just saying, if you brought in ephemeral dungeons, that would shake things up quite a bit. And here's another way to implement new dungeons. Do you know what a roguelike is? For those of you who don't, a roguelike game is a game that's essentially a dungeon crawler, but every level that you enter has randomized enemies, and therefore randomized loot that is temporary for that run. You get as far into it as you can, and oftentimes there is an end, there is a last level, a last boss, and that may or may not be randomized. But if you fail, you reset your progress all the way to the start, and you lose all of your temporary buffs that you were collecting along the way. What if The Legend of Zelda had a roguelike dungeon? Think the Master Sword Trials, but randomized. And there are so many ways to fit a roguelike dungeon into the lore, but I digress. The next thing that could fix the next Legend of Zelda would be new playable modes slash situations slash events that break up the monotonous gameplay. So here's what I mean by that. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you play your first segment of the game where it teaches you the mechanics of the game. You get your powers that you'll use in the game, and that's it. You use this same style of gameplay, this formula that you have learned for Link in every circumstance. But in past Zelda games, Twilight Princess for instance, there were so many different spots where the gameplay was broken up to introduce something urgent or just different. Like, spoiler alert for the game, sorry, but there is a moment in the game where you have to save Midna's life. She's on your back dying. You have to race to the castle. Or when you have to do the escort mission for the dying Zora Prince. Or when you have the duels on the bridge leading to the most kick kick-ass shot of Link in the entire franchise to date. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do have some of these broken up modes of gameplay, but normally they're related to maybe a side quest or something like that. I would like to see a bit more grandeur of a concept being enacted for maybe the main story or something along those lines. Number 7. We need active companions to make a return. I'm talking Navi from Ocarina of Time. I'm talking Midna from Twilight Princess. I'm talking the King of Red Lions from Wind Waker. I'm talking Fi from Skyward Sword. For most of the most popular Zelda games out there, Link has a companion. This companion character gives advice, comments on things, tells Link what to do, reminds him what his current status is. Again, to reference a game that enacts this very concept in a very well thought out way, albeit I'm not the biggest fan of this character, Genshin Impact's Paimon. That's an open world game that has a bunch of quests and different things that you can do, but Paimon follows you around everywhere and comments on everything and doesn't stop. I'm not saying the character has to be annoying. I'm just saying that it would be nice to have a companion character. And here's another element to that. What if you could choose your companion character? What if there were a bunch of choices like the older companions from the Legend of Zelda franchise, Midna, Navi, Fi, and you could choose which one of them you wanted to explore the world with, and each of them had unique things they would say, and unique pieces of dialogue, prompting you to really try each of them out, and different relationships with Link, or you could choose to have none of them, and just go it alone, without anybody talking in your ear. I think everybody would be a fan of that idea, Nintendo. Number 8. New or old lore. Now, if that sounds confusing, good. The reason why I said that is because this would be the only way to appease everybody in one fell swoop, and all it takes, Nintendo, if you're listening, is to make a choice. Either A, connect the lore from the next Zelda game to the franchise, not connecting all the pieces, but leaving pieces to be connected that makes sense, or B, don't connect anything at all. Do something new entirely. Have the only reference to previous Zelda games be the existence of Link and Zelda. Choose one or the other of these approaches to the story and lore of the next game, but do not sacrifice a good narrative trying to do both. And honestly, personally, I'm leaning more towards the side of do something new entirely. I mean, it's very obvious, isn't it? Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom aren't even connected to the timeline. They've already set the building blocks up to separate the next Zelda game entirely from everything that came before. So honestly, I think they should. Number 9. I believe everybody would benefit from the appearance of a new villain. The Zelda series will most likely never come out from under the shadow of Ganon. He's iconic, he's big, he's scary, he's beautiful. We love him, but I'm gonna level with you here. Ganon, or Ganondorf as a character, is now generic in every way. In the first place, he's not just one character anymore. He's multiple. He can reincarnate as another version of himself, so therefore it's not Ganondorf, it's a Ganondorf. And secondly, and this one is a bit more factual, Ganondorf doesn't have to have a backstory. He can just show up and be, I hate Hyrule. I want to take everything for myself because that is what a king must do. Which is the most generic villain thing I've ever heard. So let's not ruin his legacy, or do something with it that would piss anybody off. Let's just introduce a new villain. New villains have been introduced in the series before, and typically they go over pretty well. You look at me right now and tell me you did not absolutely adore Girahim. I know you did. Girahim was amazing, and Girahim's relation to Demise was amazing. Everybody loved Zant. Of course, some people have complaints about how he turned out at the end, but everybody loved Zant. Even the non-canon villains, like, what's-his-face, Astor. He was pretty frickin' cool. Malladus, Vati, Yuga, the list goes on. And I think that everybody would benefit from a new Zelda villain. Number 10. The return of underwater gameplay. Honestly, I don't think I even need to go into this all that much. Enough said. I think everybody, whether a defender or an attacker of the current state of Zelda games, misses underwater traversal. It was one of the weirdest things to remove from the era of the Wild, although everybody understands why. It's simply because it would have been too much for the development team. But I don't know about you, I would trade probably a good half of the map of Hyrule if it meant good old-fashioned underwater puzzles, dungeons, traversal, you name it, combat, whatever. Bring it back, Nintendo. Bring it back. Number 11, I don't have enough fingers for any of the other ones. Meaningful items. Listen, for you new Zelda fans, there used to be meaningful gadgets and spells and tools back in the day that Link could use. I'm talking the shovel, the spinner, ball and chain, Pegasus boots, the power bracelet, magical rods, masks, the hook shot, the gust bellows. Each of these served to enhance the gameplay, unlock new areas, new methods of combat, methods of traversal, you name it, and were all replaced for Link's arsenal of sandbox powers, like Magnesis or Ultra Hand. But I think especially if Nintendo were to do what I was talking about earlier, and remove Link's Spider-Man crawling abilities, that it would be a very welcome addition, especially for traversal. And think about the musical instruments. Oh man, Link used to have such cool musical instruments in addition to the ocarina. In Majora's Mask, he had a guitar, he had drums, he had a bagpipe things. In Skyward Sword, he had a harp. In Twilight Princess, he could howl. In Wind Waker, he had the Wind Waker, which was a baton that could conduct the notes of the wind. And each of these magical instruments were used for warping, were used for changing night to day or day to night, calling upon a storm, you name it. I think Link should have a musical instrument in the next game, maybe one that he can choose. I think that magic should return. So in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, right? You pick up a fire arrow, you fire that fire arrow, now you have no fire arrows. In the older Zelda games, you learned the ability to magically create fire arrows, and you could fire them out there so long as you had arrows and magic. And bringing magic back would open the door to all sorts of different spells. You could bring back Ocarina of Time style spells like Din's Fire, or you could introduce new ones, like imagine if Link could heal himself with magic power. I find it very hard to imagine the kind of person that would have a problem with this addition in the next Zelda game. Number 12. Bring back empty bottles. Empty bottles were a whole other mechanic that's just not there at all in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. And you can still have your magical unlimited inventory, but bottles were at least one form of inventory management that actually made sense and that nobody had a problem with. You had to choose whether or not you wanted to store a health potion or a magic potion or a potion very expensive that would restore both, or if you wanted to catch a fairy, or back in Ocarina of Time, if you wanted to catch some bugs, or if you wanted to catch a fish, or if you wanted to catch some water. It was an inventory mechanic that was cool, and I think it should be brought back, and also they were powerful enough to defeat Ganondorf. Yeah, bring them back. Number 13, a playable story. You know what I mean by that. In Breath of the Wild, you don't play through the story like we all thought we were going to when we first saw the trailers. No, all of that happened 100 years prior to the game's events. Now, we've all cried over it if we were going to cry over it or not. That's been a long time ago. And it's not that Breath of the Wild's story was not good. It was great. I just did a video covering the Kings of Hyrule, and when I covered Rome Bosphoramus Hyrule, I got sad because it's a really good story, but we didn't get to play through it, and when Tears of the Kingdom came out, they kind of teased us a little bit with Ganondorf being right there in front of Link and Zelda after the events of Breath of the Wild, meaning this is something that's going to be happening as of our control of the characters of the game. And it starts, and you see Ganondorf, and things happen, and then everything already happened in the past, exactly like Breath of the Wild. You do not get to play through it, you do not get to experience any of it. You just find it out again. And if you think about it, the last time that a Zelda game had a story that had events that you actually play through was over 10 years ago, in A Link Between Worlds. It's been over a decade. It's time. And speaking of the story, number 14, give us a linear and non-linear combo of gameplay that can actually work. It's a very simple concept that they've been implementing ever since the start, to be honest with you. Think about A Link to the Past. How many non-linear things can you do at any point in the gameplay that just pauses the linear story and doesn't affect its progression? They did the same thing in Ocarina, they did the same thing in Majora's Mask, they did the same thing in Wind Waker, they did the same thing in Twilight Princess, they did the same thing in Skyward Sword, and it's not just Zelda games. Most open world games do this. Oblivion, Skyrim, the Fallout games, even MMOs, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, Elden Ring. This is, however, one that I'm not sure that Aonuma will be very open to. In a recent interview, as you might remember, he stated that he doesn't really want there to be stories in games anymore. And I'm not sure if this was taken out of context or what, but it's definitely a strange take that does kind of make sense given his decisions with the stories in the last few years. He wants there to be a story that players kind of make themselves in a sandbox world. Like I said, it could have been taken out of context, so I'm just going to put a pin in that and not come back to it. But speaking of a create your own concept though, number 15, what if the next Zelda game implemented a diverging storyline? The era of the Wild games have already had multiple endings depending on how many things you completed in the game. What if this was just an evolution of that concept? Again, to reference another game series that does this very well, the Souls series. Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, or heck, the Five Nights at Freddy's games. There are always multiple endings that depend on your choices, even though there's only ever one that's actually the canon ending. It still doesn't matter though, because it feels rewarding to a player to have a different path through the game as another player that was different because of your choices. I'm not saying you should be able to make Link a villain, unless Nintendo really wanted to think outside the box for the next game, but the ability to alter what does or doesn't happen by the game's end might be a very welcome addition. Let the players create their own stories, right? Number 16. We need a lot more enemies. I know that Tears of the Kingdom brought some new enemies into the fold, like the Flux Constructs or the Froxes, or the Gleeoks. I kinda don't want to do this because I'm not that proud of this video, but in a relatively recent retrospective I did about Breath of the Wild, I compared the number of different kinds of monsters that you can encounter in Breath of the Wild to other Zelda games, and I'm just gonna let you have a listen to that. Early game, you get used to fighting any one of these kinds of enemies. The only real difference between their colors is their health pool. Here's a little frame of reference for you. In Breath of the Wild, and I'm gonna refer to my notes here, there are 98 total different enemies. That includes world bosses and all the versions of Ganon as well. But when you cut out the duplicates, like, you know, the multiple colors or the multiple different kinds of the same enemy that are just different elements, you are left with 28 different kinds of enemies in the game. For comparison, in Ocarina of Time, you know, a game that came out 19 years before Breath of the Wild, there were 87 total different enemies in the game, or 64 when you cut out the duplicates. That's well over twice the amount of unique enemies in Breath of the Wild. In Twilight Princess, which came out 12 years before Breath of the Wild, there were 107 total enemies, or 84 unique different kinds of enemies when you cut out the duplicates. That is literally 3 times the amount in Breath of the Wild. But yet My point is, we just need a lot more different kinds of enemies to fight in the next Zelda game. I think this is something that the series set as a standard and then kind of went back on quite a bit because they spent more time developing the map itself in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And it's definitely something that can just be changed. They don't even have to develop a lot of new enemies. Just bring back all the old enemies that we've been missing. Bring back Skulltulas. Bring back Stalfoses. Bring back Tektites. Or make new ones. And obviously, I could go on for a while, but you get the point on this one. Number 17. And this is a technical one, but I would like to see the return of having multiple save files. Listen, this is something that a lot of games are implementing these days, and I don't know that Nintendo will ever go back on, but typically these days, when you download a game, which most people do these days, I haven't bought a physical game in years. I don't even know when the last time is that I bought a physical game. It was probably Breath of the Wild, to be honest, but most people buy digital copies and download them, and when you do download these games, they are linked to your account, not to the console. And so, because of that, these days a lot of games don't let you have multiple save files. They're linked to your account. You launch that game, it's your one save file. And Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom implement this wholeheartedly. The reason why game companies are doing this is because it is so easy to just generate multiple sales. If you have a family that wants to play Breath of the Wild, and multiple members of that family want to play Breath of the Wild on their own, and you haven't bought the physical version, then you're going to need a separate $60 copy for every single person that wants to play the game. But when Zelda had save files, you were able to re-experience the game without having to erase all of your progress and maybe be a bit more experimental in your next playthroughs. Or share it with friends or family members who wanted to try the game but you didn't want to wipe your game for it. It would be nice to see save files come back. Stay with me here, we're in the last few. Number 18, I think that it could be an entirely new setting. And by that, I mean that wholeheartedly. I mean, it doesn't even have to be Hyrule. Or maybe it does, but it doesn't have to be a game that is about Link saving Zelda from the clutches of whoever anymore. It could be a Gerudo adventure with an entirely different set of characters from the ground up. Maybe they don't mess with the balance of Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf. Maybe this isn't about the Triforce, which, you know, it hasn't been about the Triforce in 10 years anyway. Maybe we need an entire new set of characters for a mainline game. And I know what you're thinking at that point, what is keeping it a Legend of Zelda game? Well, let me raise the question to you. What is keeping it a Legend of Zelda game these days? There's no Triforce. There are no pieces of heart. The things that we do recognize from older Zelda games are all different, like the Master Sword for instance, and everything is weirdly just like a reference and not actually canon to the game. We simply have Link and Zelda that connect it to the other Zelda games. They've been thinking outside the box. It's something I could see happening in the next Zelda game, and it's something that I think would only have a little bit of complaint at first, but once we all knew and understood that it was going to be a completely new story with completely new characters that is somehow otherwise connected to The Legend of Zelda, maybe it's just simply in the same universe, I think everybody would accept it, and everybody would love it, given that the narrative and gameplay are good, of course. Number 19. Listen, this one's gonna sound crazy, but keep thinking about it. We need more mounts for Link. Think about it, in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you could already go and get multiple horses, but you know what horses have in common? They're all horses. The slowest one and the fastest one are both still horses. What if Link could have a flying mount? Like a loft wing. Maybe he could fly, but it wasn't as fast on the ground, making it more convenient for him to switch from a horse to his loft wing. And what if he had underwater mounts as well? What if he could ride one of those giant seahorses like the ones that we saw in Skyward Sword? Or be tugged by a manta ray? Or I don't know, a baby Jabu Jabu? And you could further this idea with gear for your mounts that would actually enhance their speed or stamina and customize their colorations and patterns and whatever. I think that would be a huge W for everybody. Before we get to number 20, which is going to be my last point that I'll talk about, I'm going to give an honorable mention. I think that we need to rework the art style from the ground up. I think that Zelda has spent a long time being very cartoony, ever since the prevalence of super cartoony graphics in like The Wind Waker, which, if you'll recall, had such a bad backlash over its graphical style that in Twilight Princess, which was going to be Wind Waker 2 as according to the files of the game, they completely overhauled it and made it the most realistic looking Zelda game. And people really liked it. It was very popular. It was rated T. And I get that Nintendo is not necessarily trying to not market to kids anymore, but they need to remember that a huge portion of their fans are my age or older. That is to say, within the 20 to 40 age zone. We don't mind realistic looking graphics. In fact, we probably would enjoy it quite a bit. But here's the other thing about that. Having realistic graphics in a video game requires better hardware, to be honest, which is kind of why they decided to go with the graphical style that they did for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. That's the only way to pull off those vast fields of grass. But hey, depending on whether or not you believe it, apparently we might be getting the Switch successor this year, so let's see what that's all about, right? I swear, if it's just like, here's the Switch OLED Part 2, a little bit better of a screen and a little bit better speakers, I think I'm gonna riot. But anyway, the last thing that I think would be a W across the board that would make The Legend of Zelda better than ever. Number 20. We need an actual crafting system. Listen, cooking in the era of the wild feels really good, but I think we could enhance cooking. I think we could bring crafting as a whole to crafting gear, repairing your armor, crafting weapons. Imagine that cooking returns, but it's not just 5 ingredients that go into whatever dish you're trying to make. Not all ingredients are created equal, right? Why should a whole-ass turkey take up the same ingredient slot as salt? What if we had 2 protein sections and 2 or 3 like filler sections and then like 2 or 3 garnishes, each of which we could fill or not fill, that would enhance multiple kinds of status effects for Link upon consumption. Giving us a system like this would enable us to get as complex with it as we wanted, or as simple with it as we wanted, which is very important and telltale good game design. And like I was mentioning, there are so many materials to pick up in the worlds of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Why can we not craft stuff with this? We can already slaughter enemies by the dozens and break their horns off and stick them on weapons and stab other enemies with them. Why not take their bones and craft armor? Or use it as material to repair our armor. Between fusion and cooking as of Tears of the Kingdom, the elements are there for a really well thought out and intuitive and immersive crafting system. I think they just need to go that extra step and implement them all. And there you have it. My complete list of 20 things that Nintendo should implement to fix The Legend of Zelda once and for all, for everybody across the board. Let me remind you that Nintendo does listen to people, specifically YouTubers. You know how much influence the Zonai had in the story of Breath of the Wild? About a iota. You know how much they had in Tears of the Kingdom? Actually, just everything was Zonai. I guarantee you, that was probably because of all the chatter we had about the Zonai on YouTube. So if you want anything in this video implemented in the next Zelda game, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, comment below with what you want to see. More interaction on this video will get it spread around more. So let's see what we can do. And at the very least, it'll get it spread around to other Zelda fans just like you and me who will begin this conversation anew, and who knows, maybe we could make some of this stuff happen. Or hit me up on Instagram and let me know over there. Thank you so much for watching, and to my Bandit crew for supporting the channel. And that's all I've got. So as always, this is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you in the next one, and signing out. Peace!